saints. Walking with the saints, a delightful way to put it, since that's about all we can do these days is walk, and very limited other kinds of travel. And so we have a paper that I'll be presenting, and I'll just go in the order that is listed there. And then Anne, you'll follow up second with the problem and promise of the sensual for the ascetic in books 1 and 2 of Solano's First Life. And then Michael, you will bring us to a close with St. Francis of Assisi, a Protestant saint. I look forward to all of these. So let me go ahead and pull my paper up and I will get started. So Athanasius' Life of Anthony includes a line that well summarizes the effects of a life chosen by few. And it was as if a physician had been given by God to Egypt. Comes in section 87. The comment is curious when juxtaposed with his earlier description of Anthony's actual hygienic practices. And his discipline was much severer, for he was ever fasting and he had a garment of hair on the inside while the outside was skin, which he kept until his end. And he neither bathed his body with water to free himself from filth, nor did he ever wash his feet, nor even endure so much as to put them in water, unless compelled by necessity. What type of healing and wholeness can Athanasius be considering when he commends the life of a dirty-footed desert physician in uncomfortable animal clothing? I've taken some guidance from Laura Zucconi in a book called Ancient Medicine from Mesopotamia to Rome, in which she describes conceptual frameworks for various types of healers in the ancient world. One element that remains consistent throughout various cultural contexts is the view that healers, physicians, are crucial communicators between communities of the gods, spirits and demons, humans, and other aspects of the physical world. Disease, injury, ill health of all kinds are ways that mark disruption within and between these communities and that communicate that disruption. Similarly, healing is also communication of the resolution of conflict. A physician or healer is trained to diagnose and facilitate reconciliation between spheres of communities. It is in this sense that Athanasius depicts Anthony as a physician and enabler of well-being amidst trauma, crisis, and the search for consolation. First, Anthony's training. Anthony's vocation and training as a physician, and I'll speak of it that way, although technically he was not a physician, but this is what Athanasius calls him. His training as a physician began with the call of the deity. Athanasius does not describe an appearance of the deity in a dream or vision, but the call through the words of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew that Anthony heard in church following the trauma of the death of his parents. If thou wouldst be perfect, go and sell that you have and give to the poor, and come follow me, and you shall have treasure in heaven. Anthony, as though God had put him in mind of the saints, and the passage had been read on his account, went out immediately from the church and gave possession of his forefathers to the villagers. They were 300 acres, productive and very fair, that they should be no more a clog upon himself and his sister. This marked the beginning of a fundamental reordering of relationships so that his physical well-being, as determined at least by material needs, became subordinated to devotion to God and to others. His response to the call in his life had to be repeated. He subsequently realized that the funds that he had set aside to care for his sister, in fact, lured him back. He eventually chose to disperse even those funds and place his sister in the care of some faithful virgins in a convent as part of reordering his social relationships. Yet he continued to be tempted with the remembrance of his wealth, care for his sister, claims of kindred, love of money and glory, pleasures of food and relaxation of life, and the difficulty in pursuing virtue. Anthony's training in diagnosis as a physician, needs to be trained in diagnosis, came while in the desert in the form of prayer and fasting while being tempted by all aspects of life. The commitment by Anthony to the Christian deity meant the necessity of aligning himself with the expectations of that deity. Quote, "For the Lord aforetime has said, the kingdom of heaven is within you. Wherefore virtue has need at our hands of willingness alone, since it is in us and is formed from us. For when the soul has its spiritual faculty in a natural state, virtue is formed, and it is in a natural state when it remains as it came into existence." End of quote. Hence, Anthony had to be trained in Christian expectations of prudence, justice, temperance, courage, understanding, love, kindness to the poor, faith in Christ, freedom from wrath, and hospitality. Athanasius made a distinction between this training and the practice of pagan healers. He says, "Thus in days gone by arose the oracles of the Greeks, and thus they were led astray by demons. But thus also thenceforth their deception was brought to an end by the coming of the Lord, who brought to naught the demons and their devices. For they know nothing of themselves, but like thieves, what they get to know from others they pass on, and guess at rather than foretell things. Therefore, if sometimes they speak the truth, let no one marvel at them for this. For experienced physicians also, since they see the same malady in different people, often foretell what it is, making it out by their acquaintance with it." A significant portion of the life of Anthony is given to the description of Anthony coming to recognize the temptations of demons and spirits, first from his own weaknesses and eventually in their repeated appearances. This is not unlike a physician recognizing how disease takes different forms, but still the same disease. Eventually, Anthony could recognize any demon or spirit even before it arrived at his location, or regardless of the physical form that it took. He also developed the ability to discern the ailments afflicting others merely by talking with them. The goal was not to gain personal aggrandizement, but to learn and to bring correction to the world. So it said, "It is not fitting to boast at the casting forth of the demons, nor to be uplifted by the healing of diseases, nor is it fitting that he cast out devils should alone be highly esteemed, while he who casts them out should not be considered not. But let a man learn the discipline of each one and either imitate, rival, or correct it." So this is part of Anthony's training. Physical ailments were frequently described as being due to underlying social and emotional disorder. The physical signs provided clues to the powers and principalities in control of a person's life. Treating the underlying causes wrought changes in the observable realm. In addition to diagnosis, physicians in the ancient world also had to communicate between the various realms, between the divine, human, and so forth. Anthony did not actively seek to establish the practice or notoriety of a physician. Rather, he taught other desert monks and took time for those who sought him out, quite unlike a physician who's hanging out a shingle. His principal desire seems to have been to stay focused on his own devotion to God. The healing of others that others received was a result of the spread of his fame, not because of his choice to seek anything. He did not take it upon himself to command spirits or ailments, but simply sympathized, spoke in the name of the deity, in this case Christ, and counseled those who petitioned to be long-suffering and to wait for the deity to respond. The focus on acting virtuously in the face of suffering should not be mistaken for denigration of the physical. His interaction with Greek philosophers and some groups labeled as Christian heretics by Athanasius were chastised for belief in an uncreated pre-existent soul and mockery of the Christian claim of the cross and physical resurrection. Anthony claimed that his ability to heal was an act of faith that is placed firmly within the physical realm and superior to rational argumentation. So he says, "You have answered well," as he's debating with some Greeks who have arrived. "For faith arises from disposition of the soul, but dialectic from the skill of its inventors. Wherefore, to those who have the inworking through faith, demonstrative argument is needless, or even superfluous. For what we know through faith, this you attempt to prove through words. and often you are not able to express what we understand. So the inworking through faith is better and stronger than your professional arguments. So doing over speaking. Physical ailments were quite varied, at least the ones that he addressed. Some examples. An officer of the court used to bite his tongue and was in danger of damaging his eyes in some fashion. A young girl had what he labels simply as runnings from her eyes, ears, and nose that fell on the ground and became worms. She was also paralyzed and squinted. A woman afar in Laodicea was healed of pain in the stomach and side. Many demons were cast out that also caused physical suffering. So these are just some examples of some of the physical ailments that he was addressing. Yet not all were saved because of his activities, as in the case of one man who died of thirst while he and his companion were traveling. And Anthony had seen this and had sent others with water, but recognizing that the one man would not survive in part due to his own being out of alignment with God. Athanasius summarizes Anthony as a physician who helped communicate and reconcile communities of the divine, human, and natural world in the following way. And this is the longer part of the quote from section 87. Thus, therefore, he warned the cruel, but the rest who came to him, he so instructed that they straightforward forgot their lawsuits and felicitated those who were in retirement from the world. He championed those who were wronged in such a way that you would imagine that he and not others was the sufferer. Further, he was able to be of such use to all that many soldiers and men who had great possessions laid aside the burdens of life and became monks for the rest of their days. And it was as if a physician had been given by God to Egypt. For who in grief met Anthony and did not return rejoicing, who came mourning for his dead and did not forthwith put off his sorrow, who came in anger and was not converted to friendship, what poor and low-spirited man met him, who, hearing him and looking upon him, did not despise wealth and console himself in his poverty. What monk, having been neglectful, came to him and did not become all the stronger. And the line goes on. So he's bringing healing of various kinds to people just in his presence with them. Also want to suggest that Anthony was a physician for Athanasius. Athanasius writes the life of Anthony descend to monks in distant places. He and their stories are intertwined. Athanasius wrote near the end of his life, having served as a leading figure in the struggles with Arian teachings. He was present at the Council of Nicaea. He was also Bishop of Alexandria with its many responsibilities, and he suffered 5 exiles at the hands of pro-Arian bishops and emperors. He too spent time in desert isolation, struggle, contemplation, as he sought his own consolation. The struggles of Athanasius and his diaspora audience are put in perspective by the more extreme events that he recounts in the life of Anthony and his struggle to remain faithful. Passing on the account of Anthony placed them all in a community of faithful struggle and consolation. Many of our students and colleagues might benefit from becoming part of that diasporic community as they have had their own desert experience this past year. The disruption of normal life by COVID life has been articulated by many in ways that sound like forced desert exile. It's not always been a desert experience complemented by desert contemplation and reevaluation of true well-being. It's been survival until the normal goods, services, and companionship begin to flow again like streams in the desert. Our institutions have clung desperately to a semblance of normalcy to keep the lifeblood of educational services, not to mention tuition dollars, flowing. We cling tenaciously to life as we know it or want it to be and race headlong back into social engagement. We do not express self-constraint about things we may have learned in our times of isolation, as Anthony did. When he was pressed to remain in public service, he said at one point, "Fishes, if they remain long on dry land, die. So monks lose their strength if they loiter among you and spend their time with you. Therefore, as fish, we must hurry to the sea. So we must hasten back to the mountain. Less happily, if we delay, we forget the things within us." I think many of us, our colleagues and students, want to tarry. We don't want to stay where we are. We have learned new possibilities, like this online conference. But these will just be added to the repertoire, and we won't very likely fundamentally change our long-term expectations of how we conduct life. We will not embrace desert life away for extended periods of time. If we view our situation through the perspective of a physician trained in the art of communicating between communities of the divine, human, and natural, what diagnoses would we offer? What would be our treatments? Would we comfort ourselves with simplistic descriptions of materialistic or social political causes and effects? Or would we trot out divine causations that reinforce connections between human suffering and the divine? If a primary role of the physician in the ancient world is to communicate, what would be communicated now? For those institutions grounded in traditions of Christian faith, how would faith in the ultimate healer who is crucified and raised from the dead later change our notions of ill health and well-being? How will non-Christian faith-based institutions also join in that same conversation? One of the reasons for choosing to work with Athanasius' Life of Anthony is that narrative reinforces key aspects of well-being and has a tendency to upset our narratives. Material comfort, social inclusion, and emotional struggle are all reshaped in focused devotion. The narrative depicts gradual but lifelong success if success is measured by a life reoriented to true well-being. The training of Anthony as a physician involved focus, faithfulness, constant reorientation to a new conceptualization of well-being. This is a well-being that Athanasius depicts as aligning communities of divine, human, and natural world. He seems to admit that it is taken up by only a few and not widely accepted, especially by those entrenched in systems of power, privilege, and ease. It's a life of difficulty and challenge. Consolation for Athanasius and for Anthony came not from focusing on denying or avoiding suffering, but through its embrace as part of a rearticulation of the highest good of faithfulness. For Athanasius, the good physician was not one who fulfilled his preconceptions or dominant cultural notions, those notions of the good life, but one who facilitated wholeness as determined by the voice of faith, even if this voice came from one who never washed his feet. Thank you. Well, Anne, I see you've got your camera back on. Now that my paper is back down off my screen, it's good to see you. I'd like to invite you to take the stage. And I think you need to unmute.
Unmute your microphone. I can't hear her.
If you navigate
Can you go?
to the bottom bar at the bottom of the Zoom
I
screen.
I wasn't in full screen, so I couldn't get there. Okay, my paper is exactly 23 minutes long, so, and I've practiced. So as with yours, Greg, mine is about a saint and the biography of that saint. So it's sort of about two people, St. Francis and Thomas Celano. So I have to get out of here and pull up my paper, just a sec. Okay, here we go. I start with a quote from Corinthians. But thanks be to God, who in Christ always leads us in triumphal procession, and through us spreads in every place the fragrance that comes from knowing him. For we are the aroma of Christ to God among those who are being saved and among those who are perishing. To the one, a fragrance from death to death, to the other, a fragrance from life to life. Lilies, lepers, sweet, fragrant fruits, and the physicality of stigmata and other miracles, the shining, brilliant beauty of Francis's dead body, and lovely language itself. Thomas Celano's first life of St. Francis concerning the earthly journey of this ascetic saint ironically abounds with evocations of the sensual world. In this, it reminds me of my children's favorite film, The Labyrinth. The similarities between the two texts, almost 800 years apart, suggest a universal subtext in Celano. a missionary message evidently as relevant to modern audiences as to those of the 13th century. The characters in the film Labyrinth fear one thing above all, to be thrown into the bog of eternal stench as a result of making wrong choices. Sarah, the main character, goes on a spiritual journey to achieve her highest selfhood through total selflessness. Like Frances, she abandons her affluent world full of stuff and deliberately enters an unkind, unpredictable, and untrustworthy landscape in order to rescue her, quote, brother, unquote. During her journey, she must avoid many pitfalls, but the biggest of all is the ultimate black hole of materiality, of physicality, the bog. In the process of avoiding the stinky bog, she must, again like Frances, negotiate a surprisingly sensual world where nothing, especially language, is as it seems, where characters often say things like, one of us always tells the truth and one of us always lies, and where nature itself becomes a character. Director Jim Henson and writer Terry Jones, the tellers of this story, lovingly portray every detail of this geography with the camera's eye and the character's words. Much as Celano, the first teller of Frances's story, uses language to evoke the intense labyrinthine world, both natural and social, of sights, sounds, smells, and textures that the future saint must negotiate and make choices in. As I read Celano for the first time, I came to realize that in many ways, an ascetic's life is strangely more about the body in the physical world than is the life of an ordinary person. Most of us do not think much about our bodies unless we get sick. We go through the days of our lives eating, eliminating, sleeping, having sex, stubbing our toes, etc. We automatically try to get warm when we are cold and dry when we are wet. In other words, we mindlessly do whatever it takes to achieve reasonable comfort and pleasure, a state where we do not have to think about our bodies. But an ascetic, in order to renounce things physical, must be keenly conscious of them at all times. Vigilance requires awareness. Desensitization requires sensitivity. Much has been written about such saints as Teresa and Jerome, who in their letters describe spiritual experiences in intensely sensual terms. But who would have associated St. Francis's spiritual journey with the senses? What's more, the telling of the journey, which must happen in order for it to have value beyond itself, in order for brother to be saved, the telling has to happen through the very physical act of spoken and further written language. Uttered words are sensual in addition to being meaningful. Written words imply an even more deliberately physical act and a lot of material stuff. Celano's words involve the reader in an amazingly sensual environment. Even in translation, the picture painted is one that resonates through the physical body of the reader on the level of every sense. Why would Celano anchor his evocation of St. Francis in the sensual world? Possibly to make his story feel real, the eternal theme rooted in the temporal, possibly to appeal to the baser, lurid tabloid journalism side of his audience, to rope them in, possibly as contrast to show the extent of Francis's transcendence of the physical. Maybe all of these, but I sense in Celano's attention to physical detail two more substantive motives that bring together themes of truth, sensuality, and nature. Two possible motives I would like to highlight are not unrelated. First, I hear in Celano's descriptions a need to get it right, an awareness of the importance of his task, a sense of urgency to convince. Second, I believe that Celano invokes the senses to prove the truth of what he says. In his hands, sensual description becomes an authority that conveys the immediate power of lived experience. We, the readers, smell the stench of the leper at one end of Francis's process and contort with pain of a swollen abdomen and infected liver at the other end. We feel the ulcers ooze under our fingers, hear the noisy din of the town's outcry, see the writhing, twisted epileptics, taste the honey on the back of our tongues. We know these things because we experience them with our bodies. There are no intellectual questions to ask. There is no space for dialectic. Celano invites us in us an affective response to Francis, much as Francis's response to what he encountered in the natural and human realm was affective rather than analytical. Celano uses words to invoke the senses, the shared realm of human existence. This tactic has the interesting effect of making his audience the ultimate witness to the veritas of his tale, through the evidence of their own senses. In order to fulfill his prescribed mission, which is to explain, honor, and praise a man deemed worthy of sainthood by the authorities, Celano must convince us that the biography he presents is true. He needs proof to convince his audience, and then his audience becomes proof. A peculiar thing happened to me while I was researching and thinking through this paper. I constantly conflated Celano and Francis. I kept bumping up against the question, whom am I talking about, Francis or Celano? Who's the author and who's the subject? After all, it could be said that Francis created Celano the disciple before Celano the author created Francis. This experience now feels integral to understanding what Celano personally was trying to do, not just what papal agenda he was attempting to satisfy. Today, our cynical age tends to ascribe patronage motives to everything written in the past. But the artists and seers of the past were well able to develop ways to use all the space in between the lines to translate their own visions into compelling realities for the audience, the sub-audience at which they were aiming. In his very brief prologue, couched in the usual topoi of patron praise and humility, Celano manages to introduce the themes of truth, his first consideration and guide, memory, its inadequacies, words, how unskilled his are and unsatisfactory all are, authority, the command of God on earth in the person of Pope Gregory, and witnessing. His witnesses, he says, will be his own ears, Francis's words and deeds, and trustworthy others. Celano expresses concern a second time for getting the right language for his task, and finally seems quite anxious to avoid any, quote, doubt about the truth, end quote, of his story that might arise. Reading between the lines, I hear all these concerns summed up and another authority and subject subtly suggested in the concluding sentence, quote, I wish, however, that I might truly deserve to be a disciple of him who always avoided enigmatic ways of saying things and who knew nothing of the ornaments of language, end quote. Celano situates himself as not only witness, but also as authority directly from Francis, and to some extent as subject. The effective author, Francis, yields the disciple author, Celano. One critic discusses this role of witness in male hagiographies, and I have some quotes there that I'm going to skip. At this point, it feels important to note a few of the conditions inherited by and surrounding Francis and Celano, the context of their journeys. First, Francis lived in a time when symbolic spirituality, symbolic piety was giving way to dialectic. The scholastics were in full bloom, on the rise and in full bloom. Words, and especially text, had taken on a new authority in the religious realm. There was a growing disconnect between the words of clerics in universities and the lived experience of the body in the street. Clearly, the latter comprised Francis's interest and mission, although the former may have been included in Celano's perceived audience. Word as authority had gained much strength in the secular realm as well. Innocent III's 1215 ban of trial by ordeal to be replaced with a written body of law was emblematic of this movement. Word became civil law. The relationship of word and body had shifted by the time both men came along. Second, the Eucharistic debate was in full swing. In a nutshell, the problem revolved around how to reconcile Christ's full physical presence in the Eucharist with the conversion of elements that must occur at the moment the words hoc est corpus meum are spoken. I'm going to skip that part. The centrality of the doctrine of this doctrine to medieval piety. Again, the relationship of word and body were on the table, and both men would have been well aware of the extensive wordy arguments. Third, leading up to Francis's time, there was a rise in identification of Christ's humanity with his divinity. Emphasis was increasingly placed on the naked baby Jesus entering the created human world and the naked, crucified, and suffering Christ leaving it, Word made flesh. The human Christ was a powerful image in the popular imagination, Francis and Celano's audience. Fourth, there were constant reminders, especially in the growing sermon literature Francis and Celano would have heard, that Christianity promised the resurrection of the body through the word. Finally, there was a new appreciation of things material, things perceived with the senses. Carvings in cathedral doorways portrayed real flowers and trees. Gothic stonemasons reveled in the physical details of the natural world. Francis and Celano walked through cities in the shadow of these Bibles in stone and appealed to the senses of the popolo, again, their audience. As Celano tells it, Francis's spiritual journey from beginning to end was embedded in the physical and was very connected to his personal body. This palpable sense of the sensual is not as present in any of the other biographies, including Celano's second. In the first life, he describes Francis's initial conversion in stages, each of which begins with a physical experience of the body, then moves into the metaphysical realm, a very different path from his predecessors, who were often converted by visions, which then affected their physical beings, Paul, Constantine, Jerome, on and on. Francis's body is thrown in prison. His body endures a terrible disease. His body hides in a black pit for a month. People throw mud and stones at his body. His body is bound with chains and beaten by his physical father. His naked body stands before the people of Assisi. His body is beaten and thrown in the ditch by robbers. All this happens before the moment that he credits in his testament with his final conversion. According to Francis, it is at the moment when the locus of his experience moves from his body to the body of another, a leper, that he becomes truly converted. His conversion is grounded in a completely sensory experience. Even when Francis has a vision, he immediately translates that vision into a real stone stacking response. He goes out to rebuild a literal church. Everything for Celano's Francis begins with the realm of the senses. For example, Celano uses the sense of smell to unite and juxtapose, and significantly to conflate by about 6 years, two most important early moments: his personal conversion and his conversion of another, St. Clare. In 1 Celano 17, after using words like corruption, foulness, and loathsome, Celano tells us that the stench of the lepers was so bad that Francis had to, quote, hold his nostrils with his hands, end quote. Immediately afterwards, he tells of Clare's conversion and the founding of her order. As usual, he begins with a complaint about the inadequacy of imagination and words. Then he invokes the sense of smell. Remember, we readers are still holding our nostrils from the leper stench. After describing the sisters with words like grace, wisdom, and humility, Celano writes, quote, the lily of their virginity and chastity so sprinkles them with a wondrous odor that, forgetful of earthly thoughts, they desire to meditate only on heavenly things. And so great a love for the eternal spouse arises in the hearts from the fragrance of that lily, that the integrity of that holy affection excludes from them every habit of their former life. Thus we have two conversions, end quote. Thus we have two conversions through smell. At the other end of Francis's earthly journey stand three monumentally physical sensual events: the stigmata, the death of the flesh, and the transformation of the physical body after death. There seems to be a shift of emphasis for Celano in Book 2 from the base survival senses of smell, taste, and touch to the senses that most directly affect the mind and spirit, sight and sound. We are invited upward to a new higher level of the journey. As Francis's eyes get worse, Celano's seem to get clearer. He pulls into sharp focus the physical realities he probably was not even present to witness. Celano describes the stigmata as follows, quote, if I can get that back up. His hands and feet seemed to be pierced through the middle by nails, with the heads of nails appearing in the inner sides of the hands and on the upper sides of the feet, and their pointed ends on the opposite sides. The marks on the hands were round on the inner side, but on the outer side they were elongated. And some small pieces of flesh took on the appearance of the ends of the nails, beaten and driven back and rising above the rest of the flesh. In the same way, the marks of the nails were impressed upon the feet and raised in a similar way above the rest of the flesh. Furthermore, his right side was as though it had been pierced by a lance and had a wound in it that frequently bled, so that his tunic and trousers were very often covered with his sacred blood. Happy was Brother Rufino, who touched the wound with his own hands. For when this Brother Rufino once put his hand upon the bosom of this most holy man to rub him, his hand fell down to the right side of Francis, as it can happen, and it happened to touch the precious wound. The holy man of God was not a little grieved at this touch, and pushing his hand away, he cried out, end quote. Notice the way the physical touch and Francis's wince at the end of this passage serve to reinforce its truth for us. Note the way, with this one critic, I'll skip that part. After Francis's death, Celano focuses on all the joyous singing that rang out from the holy city of Assisi, sound, reminiscent of the parallel songs of praise at the end of Book 1, at the staging of the Nativity. Celano thus, through sound and especially music, brings Francis's Christ-like life full circle from naked human birth to suffering human death. In Celano 113, he reports that Francis's son's, quote, mourning was turned to song, end quote. After interpreting for us what he is about to describe by using words like proved, testimony, truth, and true image, Celano describes what the sons of Francis saw. Quote, they saw his flesh, which before had been dark, now gleaming with a dazzling whiteness and giving promise of the rewards of the blessed resurrection by reason of its beauty. They saw finally that his face was like the face of an angel, as though he were living and not dead, and the rest of his members had taken on the softness and pliability of an innocent child's members. His skin had not become hard. His members were not rigid. They could be moved this way and that, however one wished. And because he glowed with such wondrous beauty before all who looked upon him, and his flesh had become even more white, it was wonderful to see in the middle of his hands and feet, not indeed the holes made by the nails, but the nails themselves formed out of his flesh and retaining the blackness of iron, and his right side was red with blood. These signs of martyrdom did not arouse horror in the minds of those who looked upon them, but they gave his body much beauty and grace, just as little black stones do when they are set in a white pavement, end quote. Notice the way the common familiar sight of a little black stone in white pavement at the end of this passage serves to reinforce its truth for us. My personal explorations of Celano began and ended with a question. Early in my first reading of the text, I found myself wondering, why does Celano have so much sensual imagery in the biography of an ascetic? As I finished that reading, I wondered, why does Celano's Francis pick a particular passage from scripture to quote while he is dying? After he has put on his final sackcloth at the moment St. Francis's bodily existence ends and his eternal existence begins, he bursts into song and begins to quote the passage in the Gospel of John that goes on immediately to mention Lazarus, quote, whom he raised from the dead, end quote, and then to describe Mary Magdalene anointing Jesus's feet and wiping them with her hair, quote, and the house was filled with the odor of the ointment, end quote, John 12:1-3. Perhaps Celano took his cue from this moment, for Francis unites in the word the miraculous and the plain, the extrasensory and the sensory, then places us, the audience, in the picture through our own senses. We smell the odor of the ointment rising from Jesus's feet. Let me conclude by returning to one of Celano's possible agendas, what I hear as his apparent need to get it right, the urgency to convince. In my view, Celano, through his evocation of the sensual, goes far beyond his assignment from Pope Gregory. He fulfills, between the lines, what I see as a personal mission. He does not merely invite his contemporary audience to read about Francis and approve his sainthood, nor does he merely honor and praise Francis. He calls on all audiences of contemporary and future times to experience Francis through physical oneness with him, just as Francis experienced Christ through physical oneness with him. as he received the moment he received the stigmata. Francis, in Celano's telling, became a type of the Eucharist. He emptied himself of his identity and was filled with Christ, and was at the same moment transformed. Perhaps Celano hopes that through a similar participation in the biography on a sensual level, through a similar self-emptying and physical filling, we can become like Francis. He ends his narrative by pulling the biography back to himself, back to the insufficiency of words, back to witnessing, back to the creator-creation, author-subject relationship, and in a very Franciscan move, back to the senses, by quoting scripture one last time. He says that we here on earth, quote, still lie in the mire of the dregs, end quote. My text gives the source for that quote as Psalm 39:3, but I think it is closer to Psalm 33. Quote, thou hast kept me alive that I should not go down to the pit, end quote. And that psalm goes on to say, quote, what profit is there in my blood when I go down to the pit? Shall dust praise thee? Shall it declare my truth? Thou hast turned for me my mourning into dancing. Thou hast put off my sackcloth and girded me with gladness, end quote. It turns out that although a sojourner on the path through the labyrinth can indeed avoid falling into the pit, the mire of dregs, the bog of eternal stench, that bog must be encountered. The characters in a triumphal procession, reminiscent of my opening quote from Corinthians, get across the deadly bog by calling on nature. Quote, call the rocks, end quote, shouts Sarah to her friend Ludo, as she and her disciples are about to sink, and he does, and the rocks rise from the bog to provide stepping stones for the little band. Quote, the rocks are our friends, end quote, says Ludo. The bog of materiality, physicality is the reference point while we are on this leg of the journey, the starting place that will lead us to the center. Perhaps according to Jim Henson, Terry Jones, Celano, and Francis, the bog is the thing to keep our eyes on. It contains the alphabet for the language of redemption, the rocks. In sum, the bog is not something to avoid, but something to accept, understand, embrace, use, and yes, ultimately transcend. This, as I see it, is one of Celano's all-important, between the lines, missionary message in his first life. Important because, as Corinthians says, it's from life to life. And as David Bowie sings in the theme song of Labyrinth, it's only forever. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Anne. Delightful.
Gotta have a little humor.
You can't mention Bowie and Jim Henson without getting a smile. It's terrific. Thank you. Michael.
All right. Thank you, Anne, by the way, for introducing so much about Francis and the biography, since my own paper has to do with the writing of the biography, although I'm afraid I may be presenting a different view of Celano than you did so beautifully. But I learned a bit from what you had to say, so thank you. I also wanted to mention, by the way, my familiarity with Francis and his biographies comes from my experience leading a study abroad program in Perugia, which is in Umbria, which is about 20 kilometers from Assisi. There's a wonderful little church of St. Anthony Abate there. And there's, of course, incredible history, one of which, and I think, Anne, you might find this kind of interesting. You probably know this, when Francis was being carried from Siena, where he had his temples cauterized for his eye problem. The fear was that he would die en route back to Assisi. And so his caretakers, his brothers, made sure that they took the long way around to avoid Perugia, which was a fairly rowdy place, for fear that they would steal his body. The body was coveted as such. And so you can relate your views to the notion of relics and so on. In any case, let me present my own. And again, I wanted to thank Anne for that. And also the theme of asceticism in general. Okay, when Paul Sabatier was a student at the Collège de France, his teacher, Ernst Renan, placed his hand upon the student's shoulder and pronounced, You will be the historian of the Seraphic Father. The Seraphic Father is, of course, St. Francis, who had a vision of the seraph. But it would be some years before his self-published Vie de Saint Francois appeared in 1893. Sabatier's work was a sensation. It was translated into practically every European language within that decade and was subject to repeated editions. It kept selling. Although it won early praise from Pope Leo XIII, it soon prompted fierce condemnations, particularly in Italy, by defenders of the traditional view of Francis as presented in St. Bonaventure's Legenda Maior, which was a replacement for the Celano, the official church biography of Francis. In 1894, Sabatier's biography was placed on Rome's Index of Forbidden Books. On the other hand, it won worldwide praise, including a French gold medal and a Nobel Prize nomination. But more importantly, it initiated a new chapter in the history of Franciscan studies and a new, more universal appreciation for the poor man of Assisi beyond his status as a Catholic saint. I don't want to say a mere Catholic saint, but generally speaking, an appeal beyond the limits of Catholicism. And of course, what some viewed as the strength of this new, more universal Francis, his independence, his incorruptible determination to live a gospel life, and his revolutionary spirit. Others were to see, again in Sabatier's account, an insidious appropriation of a Catholic and Italian saint by Protestants, modernists, agnostics, and unfortunately non-Italians as well. As André Vaucher, in a very recent biography of Francis, a lovely book, he describes the publication of this book, the profound shock created by Paul Sabatier's life of St. Francis, a veritable thunderclap in a serene sky, comes from its substitution for the peaceful image and mystique of Francis, driven since Bonaventure by the tradition of the Franciscan order and the Catholic Church, with a dissonant view of the life of the poor man of Assisi. According to Edward Hutton, in his 1903 Cities of Umbria, and Hutton was an English travel writer who loved Italy, converted to Catholicism just to become a little bit more Italian, and I think that's the way I would put it, and despised Sabatier's account. According to him, quote, he would think of Christ as an adorable freethinker and St. Francis as a forerunner to Martin Luther. Now, this is kind of ironic, this charge, because Luther himself had mocked St. Francis, particularly in a preface that he supplied for Erasmus Alberus's Barefoot Monks, which was a parody of some sacred writings of, who was it? Pisa, whatever. In any case, Bartholomew of Pisa, thank you. Historically speaking, early accounts of the life of Francis are framed by the conflict among his followers regarding fidelity to the rigors of poverty and humility that he taught and they lived. Now, this is, I think, important in terms of context for understanding all the biographies or the whole history of biographies of Francis. Franciscan order, close to Francis's death, but during his life, broke into the spirituals, who were the supporters of the original message of St. Francis and the way of life of the brothers, asceticism, poverty, humility, and so on. And another faction known as the conventuals, because they wanted to build convents, and they sought to move in the direction of a more conventional religious order within the established hierarchical Catholic Church, well-housed and well-educated. This is a direction that was clearly opposed by Francis. Now, the first official biography, here we get to Celano, by Thomas Celano, was commissioned by Pope Gregory IX to support a speedy canonization of Francis. It was a biography, basically a hagiography, designed to present Francis as a miracle worker, which is a necessary condition for sainthood. I'm not saying that that was falsified, but that was the emphasis in terms of Chilano's work, according to Sabatier. I'm no expert on Chilano to make the judgment, but in any case, it was commissioned by Pope Gregory IX, who throughout Francis's life had tried to rein in the Franciscan order into a more established kind of thing, much like he did with the Dominicans. And Brother Elias was a friar who sought to build up the Franciscan order in a more conventional way. He was the person responsible for the magnificent Basilica di San Francesco in Assisi that you see, totally at odds with the way of life of Francis himself. So this was the dispute over that over the way of life. Sabatier sympathizes with the spirituals. Okay, this is one of the things that gets him in trouble, I suppose. Now, in order to restore peace to the rapidly expanding order of in 1263, which isn't too long after Francis' death, a generation, Bonaventure, who was then the Minister General of the order, composed a new biography, which was soon followed, again, this is important, by an order of the chapter of Paris, which was a plenary meeting of the friars in 1266, to destroy all rival biographies and their sources, which included Chilano, which understandably was never fully executed, but at least officially it was. So what Bonaventure did was to write an official biography and wanted to make it the only biography. Okay, now Bonaventure Francis was a saintly miracle worker and a docile Catholic. And this was the official image of Francis up to that point and his life. And the context for understanding of Sabatier's departure and the polarized response to it lies, I think, with the outlook of his teacher and mentor, Ernst Renan, and his project of separating the historical Jesus from hagiographical accounts, which had generated so much controversy and opposition. So if Sabatier were to follow Renan's methodology, that would mean recovering all the different accounts and sources regarding Francis's life that Bonaventure's official biography was meant to replace and to displace. So Sabatier proceeded to search for long lost texts in libraries and convents throughout Italy to support his account of the saint's life. Among his discoveries was a text attributed to Brother Leo, a spiritual and one of Francis's closest friends. The discovery was a work he titled the Speculum Perfectionis, or the Mirror of Perfection, and mistakenly dated it as 1227. Now, Francis died in 1226, and so the search was for something even earlier than Chilano by Sabatier. And this looked like he looked like he had found it, but unfortunately, the scribe who had transcribed this particular text made a typo error, I guess you'd call it. I'm not sure what you'd call it in those days, but the date was wrong by 100 years. And so Chilano's great work was very discredited by this simple but important mistake, which became the pivot of scholarly critiques of Sabatier's claims. But more serious criticism was that Sabatier had read his own Protestant beliefs into his characterization of Francis. And I think there's validity in both of these reactions, both with respect to the Mirror of Perfection and with respect to the way in which Sabatier characterizes Francis. Again, not a criticism, but a description. Okay, where was I? I don't want to lose time here. Okay, Sabatier proceeded to, okay. Sabatier's Francis was a romantic hero, more independent of the Roman Church while more responsive to his own individual conscience, or in Sabbatio's words, quote, the precursor of religious subjectivism. According to Sabatier, Francis's project of creating a brotherhood of poor penitents, following strictly the example of Jesus, was manipulated by Cardinal Ugolino, who was later to become Pope Gregory IX, who was the protector of the order and also a friend of Francis's, and Brother Elias, one of his earliest followers. So the theme in Sabatier's book is there's a bit of a kind of a conspiracy going on here among the conventuals. Unfortunately, Celano gets put into that net. The result was the formal incorporation of the Franciscan order into the hierarchical church and its normalization, including the increased number of friars taking holy orders. Francis himself never took ordination, never became a priest, and discouraged his brothers from doing so. Also, again, friars going to university and taking advanced study, such as Bonaventure himself. Okay, and of course, the relaxation on the prohibition on property, which was the worst strike against the tradition or against Francis's earliest teaching. And you might expect there was considerable opposition to those charges, particularly among the earliest brothers of Francis. Now, Sabatier did not lack for early critics, particularly in Umbria, and none more fierce than Michele Falocci Polignano of Foligno, editor and publisher of the Miscellanea Francescana. I love saying those Italian phrases. Sabatier had tried to befriend Falocci, suggesting he could help expand the reputation and influence of his journal, but with little success. A feud ensued between Falocci and Sabatier, very heated, somewhat overheated. And at one point, Sabatier submits an open letter to the Miscellanea, responding to some of the criticisms. And what Falocci does is to publish this letter with his commentary, in which he calls Sabatier's book, he said Sabatier's book contained a subtle poison, and quote, the microbes of a spiritual cholera. Now, it doesn't get worse than that, I don't think, if you know the transmission of cholera. Falocci's decision to publish the exchange, particularly its polemical tone, won sympathy for the always courteous Sabatier, even among those who disagreed with him, and disapprobation for the Foligno publisher. 1902, Salvatore Minocchi published the article entitled The Franciscan Question in the Giornale Storico della Letteratura Italiana. The article was a survey of scholarly controversy sparked by the publication of Sabatier's life. The so-called question, and you'll see this referred to in Franciscan literature, the Franciscan question, primarily concerns the authority of the sources cited by successive and rival scholars. And this scholarly debate corresponds historically to the medieval controversy regarding what it means to be a true follower of Francis. Thus, the locus of the question is the history of the Franciscan movement and the struggle for control of Francis's legacy among his surviving followers and beyond. How am I doing on time? I only have another page and a half, okay? Yeah, okay, thanks. The struggle continues even today in the scholarly literature in the form of a continuing search for source documents which may precede those considered official and which it is hoped will resolve questions concerning the saint's actual intentions, as well as the identity and perhaps the legitimacy of those institutions which claim to continue his mission. One giant of that effort, Jacques Dallaron, suggests that the perplexity of the question itself reflects the profound truth about the subject, Francis. Quote, that his message could not be reduced to one single voice. But unfortunately, the logical consequence of this claim of Dallaron is that all efforts to draw a coherent portrait of Francis would be one-sided, while all efforts to honor every source would be incoherent. So that's the dilemma. Clearly, Sabatier sensed the challenge this represents. As he said, quote, to write history is to think it, and to think it is to transform it. Thus, he concludes, quote, objective history is then a utopia. Perhaps it is unfair to say that the chief, am I okay on time, by the way, Greg?
Yeah, you said you had about another page?
Yeah, a page in, yeah, another
Yeah,
page.
go ahead.
Perhaps
Go
it is unfair to say, okay, well, I already said that. From the point of view of Sabatier's Protestantism, you might say Sabatier's Francis lacks sufficient respect for the authority of the church and its popes. He does resist many of these efforts. Obviously, challenges the wealth of the church, albeit only indirectly and by example. And the Protestant, quote unquote, as one friar identified, I'm refusing to use his name, misinterprets Francis's mystical experiences. Moreover, he does push a distinctly Protestant form of individualism and subjectivism. There is no doubt that Sabatier approaches his subject with a religious sensibility that differs from Catholic tradition. I do not agree with these charges, but it raises an important question. And this is really at the heart of what I wanted to say. Does Sabatier's liberal Protestantism allow him to see in Francis elements that are missed by scholars or were suppressed by Bonaventure and the chapter of Paris? Or does it blind him to evidence of a more traditional observance in Francis? I'm inclined to say that Sabatier gives us a different insight, but I don't want to take sides in this talk. Sabatier did put Francis' life in a new context, presenting the 13th century thus as there was, quote unquote, a genuine attempt at a religious revolution aiming at, quote, a universal priesthood in the proclamation of the rights of individual conscience. And owing, quote, nothing to the church or school, he was indeed theodidact, thought directly from God. Again, a less Catholic, more Protestant theme of direct inspiration. And if he did not perceive the revolutionary bearing of his teaching, at least he always refused to be ordained a priest, according to Sabatier. He divined the superiority of the spiritual priesthood. Let me give you one more paragraph here of Sabatier's response to this aspect, this Protestant bashing. In an address given in 1908, entitled On the Originality of St. Francis, Sabatier said, quote, those who would rely on such passages regarding individual conscience and so on to make him, Francis, a sort of forerunner of Protestantism would be completely wrong. Acknowledging that he had been charged, and if the charge is fair, he says, quote, I regret it and I will try to repair my fault, close quote. But if he was ready to examine his portrait of Francis and to alter it if necessary, his basic theological and historical commitments remain unshaken. For he immediately continued, quote, let us hope that the simplicity that I put into this mea culpa will induce my honorable critics to show an equal goodwill, and that they will cease in good time to believe that they do great honor to St. Francis in representing him as a sort of passive instrument in the hands of an ecclesiastical hierarchy. I think I'll stop it there. Thank you. Silent applause. Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you.
Get the mute off there again. Well, thank you.
I hope I
And
didn't go too long.
no, we're good. We only have the three of us, so we're fine. I
Good.
want to open it up for those who've been listening to start the conversation. If anybody wants to jump in first before the three of us go at it.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Daan van Schalkwijk from Amsterdam. Yeah, it's just a lot to digest. I'd like to open the conversation, but no, so I think a lot about health in my courses, and I find the topic of the bodily and so different types of health that Greg addressed. So the link between bodily health and kind of restoration of communities, and then the spiritual of the bodily and the spiritual link in Anne. I found it very inspiring. I have to think about it more. So I can't really. I haven't really formulated a question yet, but I just wanted to thank you for your also Michael for your contributions. It was inspiring for me.
Well, thanks, Dan. That's it's good to see some of the connections that you're making and the interest in the bodily. I'm married to a nurse, and the physicality of life is very important, and I think part of the challenge with the saints that whether it's Saint Francis or Saint Anthony or any of the others who led more of an ascetic life, we can tend to dismiss the physicality, that they were somehow pushing it off in favor of something else, but they didn't. I think, as Anne showed very well, that the physical nature of life is actually front and center. So I don't know if Michael or if you or Anne want to address that.
Yeah, I've got a comment, and I really much appreciated Anne's emphasis on as you know, in this period, there were a great many heresies. One of them, Albigensian, the Albigensian heresy, so-called, disdained the physical world. And Assisi was a center of Albigensian preaching. It's possible that Francis's own father was a member of that. And the Albigensians, the strict practice of Albigensians, was really a total renunciation of the world. The Roman Church was strongly opposed to that. And Francis somehow managed to balance an asceticism, which he modeled after the life of Jesus, with a love of the physical universe, so of physical world. So the physicality and sensuality it's there in Francis, and Celano picks it up. Make no mistake about that. He loved it. And if you quoted, I think, the canticle of creation, where he sings to God's creation and identifies species and minerals and so on as brothers and sisters. This completely different picture of the world, particularly within the Christian tradition, as one big family, and mankind or humankind as cousins to the rocks, so to speak. In any case, I wanted to mention that Albigensian aspect, and whether or not you've run across that, and to what extent did Thomas want to make sure that Francis was not mistaken for an Albigensian?
No, not at all.
I don't know.
No, not at all. Francis was Francis. Everybody else can do whatever they want with him, but he was just Francis. I wanted to say something about Anthony. Italy is my second home. I'm there a lot, and it's partly because of these people and the artists who depicted these people. Visual artists, but you reminded me so much, Greg, of the Masaccio Chapel, the little chapel with the life of St. Anthony in Florence. Do you know that?
I don't. This St. Anthony is the Egyptian, or are we talking about the same St. Anthony?
Okay, yeah, no, this is a different St. Anthony.
Oh, okay.
But it's in a Carmelite chapel, but it's but he too heals. This St. Anthony heals with his very presence. It's his shadow that heals. So there's this incredible Masaccio painting in this chapel where St. Anthony is walking and he passes, and it's his shadow, because by that time the artist had mathematical light sources and stuff, perspective. But his shadow, there are three figures in this painting, and his shadow is cast as he walks. He passes these three figures, and his face is just, it looks almost as if the burden of the world is upon his brow, I know this is irrelevant to this discussion, but it's such a beautiful painting. And as he passes his three figures, the first figure that he has already passed, his shadow has passed his figure, is standing up. The second, and they're very poor people. These are poor people off the streets of Florence. The second, his shadow is just reaching to that second, and that second one is in the process of standing up. The third one is a crippled beggar, and the shadow hasn't quite gotten to him, and he's still down on the ground. But I'm going to send you that.
That's great. I think what each of these have to deal with is the care for people's real physical needs.
Yeah.
It may not be their sole focus, but there is such compassion from their own suffering, from taking seriously in a sense, the physicality of Christ, a real death, a real resurrection, and that may go against some of the heresies that they reach dealing with as well, where they really emphasized it. But deep compassion for the real needs that people have, but not reducing people to mere physical beings in the sense of mere, like you're just an animal, and if I feed you and make you go away, then you're fine. There is more to life, and what that more is what they each seem to explore.
Yeah, I love the way each of these talks had both the subject and the author as subject matter, as subject of the talk, and the author becomes a subject in a way. I really like that, but I can't stand Bonaventure's biography. That's just a personal. Personal opinion, because I mean, first of all, he borrows heavily from Celano, so no wonder he wants to get rid of Celano.
Yes.
He wants to get rid of Celano because he stole half of his stuff from this is just me, from Celano. And secondly, he just really needed to turn St. Francis into Christ himself rather than into a disciple of Christ. There are 11 in Celano's biography. There are 11 disciples. That makes Francis disciple-like. Bonaventure invents another disciple. There are 12 disciples in Bonaventure's biography. That makes Francis Christ. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, there was a controversy, even the stigmata,
Yeah.
a lot of artists did not want to portray Francis with wounds. They considered that blasphemous and disrespectful to Jesus and his passion. For Francis to attribute that to Francis, and Francis himself didn't reveal it. I think he did to Leo, but he kept it secret. He didn't want to show off the stigmata, talking about here. Interesting.
I just taught Giotto.
Speaking of sensual art.
I just taught Giotto this morning. I just taught Giotto this morning, and Giotto's life. All the frescoes of St. Francis's life in Padua, not in Padua, not at the Scriveni Chapel, but in Assisi, of course.
Well, in Assisi, yeah.
And also in Florence at San Croce.
Santa Croce, yeah. But the big ones, the real impressive series is in Assisi, in the Upper Basilica, and it is directly based on Bonaventure's life. And I kind of agree with you about Bonaventure. I mean, but I also have some similar feelings about Celano. Unfortunately, I think they're both official biographies commissioned by popes in the church, and therefore they have an inherent bias. Bias is the wrong word. They are commissioned for a specific purpose, whether it's canonization.
The problem with that is, though, Celano's first biography, the church didn't accept it because there weren't any miracles in it. And they said, you go back, we have to have miracles. You go back and write again. And the second biography is boring because it's just it's like a collection of miracles that were cranked out for the church, in my opinion. So that the church could fast track somebody who didn't want to be a saint, didn't believe in saints, into sainthood, didn't believe in big buildings and build this big ass church in Assisi for him, didn't believe in hierarchies and made him a saint, and didn't believe in relics and put his body and his tunic as relics, and didn't want to preach in Latin, preached in Italian, and then they have this ceremony for him in Latin, of course. I mean, the whole thing is just so ironic. But I like Celano's first biography. It's personal. It's the second one. It's the second one that's full of miracles and is in service to the church, is my opinion.
The other problem is Celano really didn't know Francis. He wasn't part of his original brotherhood. And there were plenty of surviving witnesses to the early life and the early formation of the order, which the Pope did not invite to contribute to that. Celano was aware of that later on. And so in his second biography, although it may be more boring, it's a bit more complete in terms of a reference to some of those earlier sources.
Yeah, that's true.
But
it's a collection of
either way, Bonaventure uses Celano, and there's no surprise. And Sabatier, basically Bonaventure is the villain in the story of the biography, and Elias and Gregory the Ninth are the villains in the story itself.
Well, cool.
I'm doing too much talk.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, Dan.
Yeah. So this is a change of topic. Sorry for that, but I was wondering whether, because we've been talking about these different levels of health, which again I think is very interesting. Do any of you have, maybe starting with Greg, but do any of you have ideas about like how the symbolism of the body reflects into the higher levels of health, like a restored health between communities, either between people or between people and God? Oh, Anne has a...
Yeah, I don't know with Athanasius that he focused on any particular part of the body that did. It's interesting that he describes Saint Anthony as almost like a John the Baptist figure. This very uncomfortable animal skin that would irritate his body constantly. He never washed, etc. So it's the general condition, I think, of the body. The way he describes him physically is the body away from the material comforts that he had come to know in Alexandria. That Athanasius had known, and certainly Anthony, living in the Delta region, would have known some of those social material comforts. And so the body as a whole, rather than any part of the body, was the way he described Anthony was a way of describing a person who is acting faithfully, right? If you are put yourself in these hardships, perhaps on the verge of death, you're imitating the mortality of Christ. But you have people with various kinds of ailments. The girl who has a whole variety of illnesses, and there's nothing in particular that's being highlighted there, because another woman has a problem with a pain in her side. Somebody's got eye problems. Right. So there's no physical ailment that is indicative of a particular problem. They seem to be just whatever it was. Likewise, the healing was not to a particular part of the body. There wasn't a relationship to body parts and deities in the way that it might have been described in more ancient depictions of healing, where the actual body parts would be representative of particular deities, which makes it very different than the stigmata and the way that, Anne, you were describing the nails and the flesh, and that's going in a whole different direction.
May I make a couple comments to your question, Dan? Three things occur to me just off the top of my head. One is Boethius, the Consolation of Philosophy. This is a really old metaphor, certainly in Christianity, that you are sick spiritually. He wrote that in prison in his last year of life, and he was suffering greatly when he raised those three issues of the problem of evil, why do bad things happen to good people, and the problem of free will in that wonderful little text. But he the whole metaphor in that book is that he is sick spiritually, physically and spiritually, and that nurse theology philosophy, they're called then, but then it was theology. Nurse theology comes and they have a Socratic dialect back and forth. And she heals him spiritually through this process of conversation. So the medical metaphor is been around for a long, long time, goes way back for. But another thing is that at this time, at the time certainly of Francis, I know, but and before then, there was a corporate theory of society. Corp coming from corpus, as in body. So if your identity was as an individual, that was the wrong word to use at all for this time, but one's identity was what one did and what part of the corpus of society one was. You know, if you're the king, you're the head. If you're a serf, you're the foot or whatever. But the idea, you all know this, I'm not saying anything you don't know, but the idea is that the whole society is sick if one part of the society gets sick. So healing, and then one of the things you said, Greg, that I just really loved was that the ability to heal is an act of faith. And that really reminded me of Boethius too. It's ultimately coming down to his healing was an act of faith. Anyway, those are a couple ideas.
Yeah, and that's where faith is really tangible. His argument with the Greek philosophers that show up, he's making an argument about the real tangible physical change as something that precedes argumentation. So it's, and I wonder how much of this is Athanasius dealing with his Arian counterparts. I kept wondering what in the world was he dealing with in that Arian controversy that set so much of this up, because at the end of the life of Saint Anthony, he actually has Anthony interacting with some Arians who show up and how he had dismissed them. So what is it about the tangible physical nature that he puts a high priority on? And does it go back to this, the way that the Arians were dealing with the physicality of Christ? That physicality becomes actually a mark of faith.
Well, Greg, Francis himself chastised his body continuously, starved himself, exposed himself to the elements continuously, and towards the end of his life apologized to his body for the bad health that he had acquired. Matter of fact, when they exhumed his body centuries later, they discovered what malnutrition and a few other things the poor guy suffered from. And he referred to his body as brother ass, a workhorse, but sometimes put a brother, to him.
Right.
And he regretted and he apologized for squandering his health in that way, apologized to the body. But I'm thinking of something else. I don't know if this ties in as well. Recently, I'm doing some research on Jean-Paul Sartre's Marxism. And he wrote this huge, incoherent critique de la raison dialectique on amphetamines. He would apparently just be chewing these Coradrain pills. And he was asked towards the end of his life by an interviewer, well, now don't you regret that you ruined, because he went blind, he really messed himself up. Don't you regret now that you ruined your health for the sake of this book? And Sartre's answer was, what is health for? If not to use it for this purpose. Very strange notion of the body, I think. Of course, Sartre's an atheist, so he might have. I think
that's a difference between Anthony and Athanasius, is there's not the same kind of mortification of the flesh as if the flesh itself is bad. It's more of training, because he was so tempted by the things that we would associate with the goods that come from society, wealth and luxury and such. And so it wasn't that his body was bad, it's that he really needed to keep it under control. And so the last line I didn't read from his work is actually that at the end of his life, Anthony was quite the picture of health. He actually was in better health in his 90s than most other people were in much earlier stage, because he had lived such
Well, in
a,
fact,
in a sense, a good, clean life.
And he walked around the
No
desert.
smoking, drinking.
That's right.
He got a lot of exercise.
He's well preserved by the sun, I suppose, but even though his
Yeah,
gums had
maybe.
receded, he had not lost even a single tooth. So it's actually the way of
Wow.
saying that it's a different way of controlling the body. You know, those people who follow more austere dietary plans today, because it's, quote, healthier.
Francis was a vegetarian, obviously. In fact, when at one point when he got sick, if I'm remembering this correctly, at one point he got sick and he was put in kind of a hospital, and he was semi-conscious, and they served him some chicken broth. Good old fashioned healing
He-
thing. Chicken broth. And when he realized that he had consumed brother chicken, he was mortified. I mean, like literally, probably flagellated, mortified.
This is true. Chicken was the food of the aristocrats, of the nobility.
Yeah.
Birds, generally speaking, fowl, things that flew or that ascended. And the common people, if they ate protein, it was generally fish or seafood, stuff from below, you know.
Yeah.
And there's a story about, but Francis had a rule that if you were a guest in somebody's house, you eat what that person gives you. You accept their hospitality. So he wasn't a vegetarian in the sense of saying no thanks. But with respect to chicken and chicken soup, yeah, the issue there is class as
Yes.
opposed to, you know. And so anyway, there's a story of Francis at a nobleman's house, and there's a beggar at the door, and the nobleman's serving chicken. And there's a beggar at the door, and Francis leaves the table with a chicken bone and gives it to the beggar. But it turns out that the beggar is an imposter and an enemy of Francis. And the next time Francis is giving a public sermon, this guy steps forward and says, "You're a phony, Francis. Look, here's the chicken that you were eating." You know, and everybody turns and looks, and the guy's holding a fish in his hand. These are these crazy stories.
Well,
There was
we are, I'm reminded that we have 3 minutes left, and that the room that we're in actually has to be used by a different group. So I want to see if there's any other closing comments. Anybody want to try to wrap it up for us, or one last? That's a great way to silence everybody, actually.
Well, this
I want to say thank you to everybody. And Anne, when you're in Italy, come and see me. I'm there every winter in
Yeah.
Perugia.
in Perugia. Well, I've been to Assisi. One of the most spiritual experience. I'm not an organized religion kind of person, but one of the most spiritual experiences I've had was going down into the lower chapel at 6:25 in the morning when the brothers sing their prayers and the songs, and I was the only lay person there. And the song, the chanting of the prayers, the singing of the prayers by these people who do that every single morning, whether anybody's there or not. I mean, no, they're not doing it for anybody, you know, they just do it every single, and sending that out.
Try
over
that
the- It's,
Well,
The tradition.
I guess. Thanks, Anne. Nice meeting you all.
All right. Well,
Thanks.
I'm grateful for everybody to be here,
do we
and
get addresses of each other? Do they pass that out? Will we get each
it
other?
should be. Kelsey, do you want to say anything about what